fellow pen lovers and stationery enthusiasts, it's Christy here, Snarky Wordsworth over on Instagram and Reddit, and today I have 8 more shades of gray to share with everybody out there. So during my last video all about grays, I had a lot of people comment and then DM and message me that they wanted to see more shades of gray. Now, I happen to love grays, so I have no problem with that. But I do think I've picked a different selection that might appeal to people even more than my previous colors. These ones run the gamut of traditional grays, blue grays, sort of purpley grays, and hopefully something in this selection will catch your eye. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get to the swatches. Okay, we are going to get things started with a Pilot Iroshizuku ink. This one is Kiri-Same. Now, I adore Iroshizuku inks. They are so wet and so versatile. They work in pretty much any nib I throw them at, and I'm very excited about this one. So Kiri-Same leans much more neutral, much warmer than, say, Fuyusyogen, and I have a pen that's coming that I think this is going to look absolutely gorgeous in, so keep that in mind. But yeah, I just really enjoy this when I'm looking for a slightly warmer toned gray or neutral toned gray, so this one might be perfect for you if you were looking for the same. Okay, so that was Pilot Iroshizuku's Kiri-Same. You can see it has that nice sort of warm or neutral tone to it. There's a little bit of shading. It's not a heavy shader for me, but it does have some, and it's very wet. Even with my terribly unskilled kakimori hands, my kakimori nib did just fine with it. No hard starts, no nothing. And you know, if it's a video with me, and the kakimori nib does just fine. It's usually a very, very nice ink. So yeah, we're just going to let this dry down completely, and then we'll be back later to see exactly all of the different shades and how it looks completely dried down. Okay, next up is one of my all-time favorite inks in general. This is Diamine's Earl Grey. I mentioned this in my 8 pens video. I love this ink. It was one of the first inks that I really found myself gravitating towards all the time, and even years down the line I still use it a lot just because it's very reliable. It lays down a beautiful line of ink and is just really interesting in general. Okay, so that is Diamine's Earl Grey. You'll notice this one is much, much cooler. As it completely dries down, there also will be a tiny, tiny hint of pink in there, which I absolutely adore. And that was one of the things that drew me to this in the first place. I'd not really been familiar with inks that had all of these different color properties in them. So Earl Grey was really sort of a gateway for me. But you can see it's quite a wet and reliable ink. There's some pretty decent shading. It's not crazy by any means, but there is a little bit. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful color in general. I think this is one of the prettier grays in my collection. Okay, up next is another Diamine ink. This is from one of their Inkvent calendars, and this is Ghost. It's one of their standard inks, so there's no shimmer or anything like that, but it is absolutely stunning. There is a ton of shading in this one, and I really, really like it. So again, this is Diamine's Inkvent Ghost. As you can see, it's a slightly lighter gray, but with a load of shading. It's still wet, but you can already see the variation in color. I think this is such a gorgeous, gorgeous shade of gray. There's some blues and some pinks and some purples in there, and it's just a lot of fun to write with. It does run drier than, say, like the Earl Grey or the Kiri-Same, at least in my opinion, but I do really enjoy it. I don't think it's dry in a detrimental way. It's just something to keep in mind. I did have a little bit of hard start trouble in my Kaveco Extra Fine, which is perpetually finicky for me. So it may be more of that nib issue than anything else. But while these two do not give that particular nib any issue, this one does sometimes. So like I said, just extra information so you can make an informed decision. But yeah, still definitely recommend. Lovely, lovely ink. Okay, next up is one of Colorverse's Joy in the Ordinary line inks, and this one is called Under the Shade. Okay, and this one, as mentioned, was Colorverse's Under the Shade. I really like that this, when it's dried down, has some green leanings to it, so much more neutral, a little bit warmer, and then that green comes through, and it's just a really, really great neutral shade of gray, especially if you want something with just a hint of color. Okay, next up is one of Cult Pen's exclusive Dominant Industry inks, Dusk. If you've been with me for any length of time, you know I love Dominant Industry inks. This is a beautiful purpley blue leaning gray. I really, really enjoy it. It's got shimmer in it. You know how I feel about shimmer a lot of times. And it's just a lot of fun to write with. Okay, so that was Dominant Industries Dusk. As you look at this swatch, you might kind of be wondering why I picked it, because it does seem very, very purple, and it is. It is a very heavily leaning purple, but I still, when you see some of the lighter areas, consider this kind of in the gray family, or at least when I'm looking for gray, this is sometimes an ink that I end up choosing. And you can also see in some of the pathways where it does shade heavily as a gray color with purple leanings. I really, really like this one. The level of shimmer in it is very comfortable. It doesn't clog my pens. I actually use this in a well-tuned Sailor Extra Fine, which sounds insane, but Richard Binder tuned the nib for me, and it was actually writing a lot wetter than I was expecting, which is not a problem. But because of that, I decided, let's throw this in there and see what happens. Because at that point, I was just like, I just wanted to experiment. And it actually writes so beautifully in there. So it does write even in that particular nib. And I really, really enjoy the output. The color is just absolutely gorgeous. Whether you think this is too purple to be considered a gray, or you agree that it kind of is a gray with heavy purple leanings, it's a lovely, lovely shade. Okay, next up is one of my new favorites. This is Birmingham Pen Company's Antique Aubergine. Okay, and this is Birmingham Pen Company's Antique Aubergine. Like I said, this is one of my favorite newer inks. I adore this color. Definitely gray with purple, red, maroon leanings. It's just a fantastic, fantastic ink, like most of Birmingham Pen Company's colors. This one is marvelously wet, works in pretty much all of my nibs, and just produces a really, really beautiful shade. Okay, my last two inks are both from the Atramentis document line. That just means they are very water resistant, and these two colors are absolutely lovely. I use these quite frequently in journals when I want to make sure that my entries will stand the test of time. This one is labeled as blue gray, but it's also frequently labeled as London gray. I've seen both labels out there, and it definitely has a very, very heavy blue lean to it, but I think it is absolutely stunning. Okay, so that was Atramentis' Document Blue Gray / Fog Gray ink. You can see it is a beautiful, beautiful color. Whether you think it leans too blue to be considered a gray is up to you. I do think that it does have gray undertones, and I absolutely adore this shade. For me, just FYI, I think the document inks have a tendency towards a kind of almost slippery feeling, at least in the handful of Atramentis document inks that I own and have used. I haven't used all of them, so if you feel very differently about that, you let me know. I think the ones that I own all tend to also feel quite wet, which I like. But again, if you have different experiences, feel free to share those. Okay, final ink for today is another of the Atramentis document inks, and this one is in Urban Gray. Okay, so that was my Atramentis document ink in Urban Gray. It is a more neutral kind of gray with sort of almost black leanings, though don't be taken unaware by my swatch. I put way too much ink down, my apologies. But even here you can see it is definitely a very dark gray comparatively. I really enjoy this when I'm doing, you know, a more straightforward kind of journal entry or in collections where I want it to feel a little bit more serious, I suppose. But again, remember I mentioned that sort of slippery vibe to the blue-gray Atramentis ink. That is still present here. Now, I have only used document inks from Atramentis, so if that sort of slippery feel is present in all of Atramentis' inks, please let me know, because I'm very curious about that. Like I said, I've only used this particular line, so I'm not particularly sure about that. Okay, so here are my 8 more shades of gray all laid out for you. I'm going to take about 10 minutes to let these dry down completely, and then we'll come back, do some close-ups, and some final thoughts. Okay, about 20 minutes have actually gone by, and these inks are mostly dry at this point, so I want to go ahead and do some close-ups and do some final thoughts for you before we close out the video. Okay, here is Pilot Iroshizuku's Kiri-Same. As mentioned, it is a bit more of a neutral gray. Some lovely light shading, but nothing really, really crazy heavy there. Below that is my Diamine Earl Grey. Again, this is one of my all-time favorite inks. It was kind of a gateway ink for me where I started to really learn how inks could be much more complex than my standard Waterman Black. This one has a little bit more shading and it does lean cooler, and I do really, really enjoy it. It's wet, it's reliable, and just overall a lovely, lovely ink. Below that is a new addition to my collection. This is Diamine's Ink Vent Ghost. This one has quite a bit of shading. You can see here throughout the text itself, some gorgeous, gorgeous shading there. And then, of course, when you pull the ink, tons of shading there. Now, this one is slightly more finicky than, say, Earl Grey, but still totally usable, and pretty much most of my nibs have not really had too many problems. I think I mentioned already that the only nib that I really had trouble with was in my Kaweco Brass Sport in the extra fine, and that one's a persnickety nib to begin with, so I don't think that that's necessarily indicative of this particular ink. Okay, right below that is Colorverse's Under the Shade, just a really interesting green-leaning neutral tone, really very pretty, and it has some nice shading going on there you can see in the text. Now, this is one of the two inks that's still a little bit wet. This is Dominant Industries Dusk. This one leans hard into purple territory, but it has some beautiful, beautiful shimmer. You can pick that up in the text. But this one is lovely, very cool, very, very pretty, very purpley, and really nice when you're looking for kind of a change. Now below that is one of my new favorite inks. This is Birmingham Pen Company's Antique Aubergine. Super wet, super, super beautiful color. Blue, or not blues, sorry. Purples, reds, maroons, on top of that gray, and loads of shading. Just an all-around fantastic, fantastic color. And then one of my two water-resistant inks. This is Atramentis Document in blue-gray / fog gray. Definitely hard leans into that blue, but you still get some gray in there. Just a really, really pretty standard color that I think works very well if you're looking for something that will work for an archival purpose. And below that, now this is partly my fault because I did put down a huge dollop of ink to make that swatch, but it is quite a wet ink. It takes a bit to dry, at least it has in my experience. And this is just a really neutral, very dark gray color. I think it has, you know, the best properties as far as archival purpose goes. Really nice, neutral kind of gray that definitely will work for something, you know, that you want to have a little bit more of a serious feel for. Okay, so that is it for my 8 more shades of gray video. These are really lovely colors, and if you happen to have any comments about any of these inks, especially these two Atramentis Document inks, because again, I think the more experience you have with line, the more you know about it, and I don't know anything outside of the document inks, and I only have a handful of those. So insights into that would definitely be, you know, really valuable, I think, for me, of course, but then for anyone else who's reading through the comments. If you have any questions about these, any questions about nibs that I've used them in, if you have any thoughts of your own and experiences of your own, please, please, please share those in the comments. If this video has been in any way entertaining, useful, informative, please do consider giving it a thumbs up or potentially even subscribing to the channel. So that is it for today. As always, thank you so, so much for joining me. If you've made it to the end of this video, you are absolutely everything that is awesome. And hopefully I will see you next time. Bye-bye.